Good morning, children. Welcome to Punkerpad West in Van Nuys, California. I'm Andrew. Today, we're going to be mixing a song by Ziggy Marley called Fly Rasta. I mixed this for his latest album, also conveniently called Fly Rasta, so that should make it easy to find for you. And today, we're going to be mixing this song completely in the box, as the kids say these days. We're going to be mixing in Pro Tools, and we will not be using any analog gear at all. The first time it will be turned into analog audio from this process is when you listen to it. So it should be a fun, exciting day. And the other thing is, what we've decided to do is not to deconstruct the mix I'd already done, but actually attempt to reconstruct the mix that I did for the record. So I'm starting with the completely bare bones session that I was sent, a very clean session, few plugins in it. And then I will be going through my entire mix process, both from a mixing perspective and also just from a listening and philosophical perspective, because that's a huge part of my mixing, is how things feel and decisions not based on the sonics necessarily, but based on the emotion that happens while you're listening. And then there are also going to be a few things we're going to deal with that are very specific to the genre. Ziggy Marley obviously works in a wide variety of styles, and there's always a reggae element due to his heritage. But he can be more in the straight-up pop style or fall back into reggae. This song is definitely rooted in the reggae tradition, which is why when I first heard it, I was absolutely terrified. I feel like I can work in the pop world and I know what's going on. The reggae world, as much as I love listening to it, is not a place I've done a lot of work, and it's interesting. It's a big weight to put on your own shoulders to go into this amazing musical tradition and really try to do something new in it, but also be faithful to what's going on. It kind of gives you some extra parameters to work in, which is exciting and constricting in a good way, but also completely terrifying. So I'm going to play you a little bit of the song as they sent it, and you'll hear perhaps why I was so frightened.
Now this is Daddy U right upside the band called Ziggy Marley with a musical sound saying Fly Rasta,
Fly Rasta,
no fly Rasta,
Fly Rasta,
trailer down and train. Now you got to hold up your head, yo. Redder down and red. Say not you rougher than rough. Take that vow of self.
So not only is it reggae, and not only is it Ziggy Marley, the son of Bob Marley, there are background vocals by the daughters of Bob Marley. And you may notice the very first thing you hear is not even a Marley, it's Uroy, who, if you don't know who he is, you need to hit up Wikipedia right about now. He is basically one of the inventors of something called toasting, which is a Jamaican form of MC and rapping all tied up in one, and he is an absolute legend. So that's why I was frightened. But now I've gotten over my fear, and we're going to go ahead and mix this song. So the very first thing we're going to do is to transform the session from looking like a bunch of gray and black audio tracks into something that is more workable for me. One of the main things I like to do while I'm working is to have things look familiar. So one of the main ways I do that is with color coding. It's really simple. It's something I've been doing since colored Sharpies were invented, so most of my career. Certain instruments get certain colors, and that way, at a glance, when I'm looking at the session, I know what I'm looking at instead of having to read track names and do anything that could distract me from what it is I'm trying to do. So the first thing we're going to do is arrange the tracks, put the colors on them that I like, and I guess we'll just start right in. So the very first thing I see is there's a click track. Well, I'm not going to mix the click, so I'm going to hide that guy. I like my vocals down at the bottom of the screen because then they're down near the mix later on. So we're going to move those down. You can see lots of tracks flying by, and we'll talk about all of them as we go. I'm going to jump back up to the top here. Background vocals. I should have dragged those down with the lead vocals. Let's see. Do we want them above the lead vocal or below? We'll put them below. Why not? Back up top. Okay, drums. That's what's supposed to be on the top. And looking really quickly, I can see that we've got one drum kit here, and then we've got a drum overdub. I don't know what that is yet, but at the moment, I'm not going to color it anything different because I really don't care. We're going to pretend that that's all one thing. So for me, in Sharpie, drums are black. In Pro Tools, they're this dark purple because it's in the bottom left-hand corner and it's really easy to find. And black is for things that don't get a color. So that's the way I see it. Moving down, we've got something called lightning. So now normally while I'm doing this, by the way, I'm cycling the song because we'll talk about this more in depth in a minute, but I actually love hearing the rough mix. And in this case, the session was sent with everything routed to one stereo bus, and that's what they were using for their rough mix. I absolutely want to hear why they thought the record was ready to be mixed. And the only key to that is to listen to the rough mix. Sometimes you listen and you realize they wanted to mix because they were just sick of working on the song. But with most people who make records more than once, they're done because they think the song feels great, the arrangement is perfect, all the overdubs are done, and the performance is amazing. So I need to get the sense of that out of the rough mix. So I would have this playing. If I did that, you wouldn't hear me speak. So let's pretend the mix is playing in the background. So I would actually just move over here, solo up the lightning real quick, say, hey, it's lightning. All right, that's a sound effect. There is no color for lightning. So for now, let's make the lightning this purple. I don't know why, but that's something to do. So again, the song would be cycling. Here we've got a lot of percussion with a lot of edits. And one of the reasons I didn't want to start completely from scratch is while we were working on the song, this percussion arrangement took shape. When I first received the song, all of these percussion instruments went all the way through the song with the idea that once we sort of built the track, we'd decide what we needed to use. So I'm starting with a final arrangement of the percussion, but sonically, I've stripped it all back. So let's see. There's quite a bit of percussion, actually, all the way down to here. And I keep hitting the wrong key here. Here's the percussion. Percussion is brown. That should be obvious to everybody. And if you don't know why, I can't explain it. It's too complicated. There's really absolutely no reason for it, other than it was a color Sharpie that I had laying around, and I was coloring the console. Then we've got a bunch of brass, and there's actually some very interesting stuff that we'll deal with later to do with the brass. All live horns recorded in a great sounding room, which we'll listen to separately later. Live instruments, because most of what I work on has a live rhythm section, those are very set colors for drums, bass, guitars, piano, that kind of thing. Then sometimes there's string overdubs or horn overdubs or whatever, so there's this sort of range of red to purple, so that's too bright. I don't like that. All right, those look like horns to me now. Really simple, easy to deal with. Bass is blue. I don't need to even talk about that anymore. Guitars are green, obviously. And on this particular song, I'd probably just leave everything green because there aren't that many guitars. If I'm working on a song that has a lot of guitars, then I'll start to use variations in the green. Because again, it's not just because I'm crazy, though I am. It's because I want to be able to glance at the screen and know what's going on, not say, oh, that's one of the 50 green tracks. Which one is it? So generally, I will shade my guitars from heavy being the darkest green to the cleanest guitar all the way up to acoustic being the lightest green. In this case, we only have two guitars, and as you can see, one of them ended up not being used at all. So we'll just go with one green there. Then we've got some keyboards, and again, we don't have a huge number of keyboards, so I'm just going to give them all this dark purple, which is kind of the same as the lightning, but that's fine. I'm not going to get confused between the lightning and the keyboards, so I'm okay with that. Now we're down to our lead vocals. And due to some people who I've worked with who have an aversion to red Sharpie, it's bad luck to use red Sharpie on a console, I've strangely gotten to the point where I can't use this bright red color anymore. It's bad luck. So therefore, lead vocals are orange, and background vocals are one of these orange or yellows. And this really sort of depends on how many sets of background vocals they are. I want things that go together to have the same color, but then I want differing groups of the same thing to have slightly different shades of the same color. So just like with the guitars, if we had, let's say, two sets of background parts, each of them being made up by 4 to 7 tracks, then each sort of group of tracks that made up one vocal part would have its own shade of the same color. That's looking a little brown to me, so there you go. There are background colors. And then at the bottom of the session is just a print track. So right now it's just getting bus 47 and 48, which is what every single track in the session is routed to. So this is pretty much okay. Normally, actually, I would put the bass guitars and keyboards up above the horns, just because that sort of keeps my traditional rhythm section together. So now that I've got everything color-coded in a familiar way that's going to work for me later on, we're going to move on to the next part of the session prep. And this next part is very particular to mixing in the box. So I have something here called Ziggy Template. Open this up, and this is, you'll notice if we scroll through, it's all VCAs and auxes. And what I'm going to do is import everything and import everything about it. And here we go. So all these tracks are at the bottom of my session, and some of them are actually going to stay there, but we're going to sprinkle these within the session next to the tracks they're either most strongly associated with or they're only used with. And as you'll see, there are very few things that I do only to one individual instrument, and that will become much more apparent later as we start to talk more about the parallel compression chains and effects chains that I use. So, starting from the top of what I brought in, there's something called toms, then tom verb, then a kick, snare, crush, snare, verb, drums, because this is a VCA, drum crush, and that's all drum stuff. So I'm going to drag this up to the bottom of the drum kit, because for me also in my head, audio falls down. So all of my audio goes to the bottom of the session, which is why I print my mix at the bottom. I know it's crazy because audio doesn't flow downhill. In my head, it does, and we're spending the next several minutes inside my head. With all of the tracks that I'm importing, they are either aux faders, which are going to process audio, collect audio from sends from all over the session, or there are also VCAs, which are a special kind of fader in Pro Tools, which does not pass any audio of itself. What it does is it allows you to collectively adjust the audio for all of the faders in a group, but it's slightly different than doing it by just grabbing some of the faders within the group themselves. It's almost like having a global trim for anything within the group that you assign the VCA to. The other thing that it does, and the reason I use it, is it also has some very special behavior when you're soloing, and you're going to see why that's really important. The other thing is, I've just found that I don't like cascading all of these tracks through lots and lots of extra buses and auxes. I want the simplest signal path through the mixer as possible. Being a digital mixer, it's not like you're adding lots of extra analog amplifiers and transformers and things that color the sound necessarily, but you are adding to the complexity of the delay compensation within the mixer because you're creating more paths to the monitor path. And also, and these have been fixed since I started doing this, but also there used to be some very odd bugs that would only crop up every once in a while due to audio taking many paths to the monitor output. And I just got out of the habit of doing it, and it works for me now. And it actually keeps the mixer very, very simple, which later on, once the mix has most of its processing in and the delay builds up within the mix, it actually keeps the delay down so that you're not trying to do a fader ride a second before the audio actually happens. All right, so now I think we're kind of running out of things I can do without actually playing audio. So just to quickly recap, I've color-coded everything because I'm crazy that way. I have imported lots of things from my template, most of which are either auxes with things we're going to use for parallel compression later on. There are a couple of effects. There are a few times when I'm running instruments through auxes on their way to the mix bus, but most of the tracks are going to be going straight to the mix bus, even though I haven't assigned that yet. And then finally, my mix bus goes through something I call a router because it routes audio from one place to another, which has a master fader on it so I can affect the level going to the plugins that are on my stereo 2 bus. Now, one thing you might be wondering is why am I bothering with a master fader, which I can put inserts on, and then also running to an aux fader and then going through the aux and printing out of it? The main reason is because there are actually quite a few reasons. Two main reasons for doing it this way is that my stereo aux with the plugins on it evolved while I was mixing in more of a hybrid fashion, so I had audio coming in from the outside world to hit these plugins. And then when I started moving into the box, I love how the way master faders allow you to almost redo your gain structure after the fact and in a really simple way. One main difference between master faders and aux faders is on every type of fader except the master in Pro Tools, all of the plugins are pre-fader. So changing the level of the fader doesn't change the level going into the plugins. So I personally, from being someone who grew up on analog recording, the idea of post-fader inserts is crazy to me. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So what I really wanted to do was completely separate the gain structure idea from the processing idea. The other thing that it allows me to do, and I didn't do it on this particular track, but there are quite a few songs where one of the easiest things you can do is called a slippery fader, where you actually turn the mix up half a dB in the chorus, and then you turn it back down, whether you come back down slowly or right at the downbeat of the verse, you come back down. If I was doing that sort of automation, I can do that on my aux fader, where 0 is my loudest part of the mix and everything else comes down from there in big chunks. But I can still go back and just grab my master fader anytime I want and bring the mix up and down to affect how it hits my stereo bus and fix any problems I may have created as I'm working on the song over the course of time. So it really separates those two functions to use the master and the aux, even though I could probably figure out a way to combine them. I just don't want to. So now what we're going to do is go back through the session and make sure that the groups are assigned properly so that my VCAs are going to work. So I'm going to quickly enable groups. I've selected all of my drum tracks, and I notice there is a group here that's already selected. Sometimes I have to make new groups because they've added overdubs or done some editing. Sometimes they already have a group that'll work, so I'm always willing to reuse a group. So it turns out that this group, which is called Steve, Steve Drums, that's my drum group. So this VCA, because it was imported from the mix template, is already assigned to Steve Drums, which is great. So I can mute it, and you can see the drums are soft muting. I can solo it. None of the drums mute. Everything else in the session soft mutes. So I know that VCA is working. Then the lightning does not have a VCA, and probably because it's just a sound effect and it only happens once in the song, I'm not going to bother with a VCA for these. It's very seldom that I don't have a VCA for every track in the session. So, all right, since I said that, we're going to go ahead and make one. So let me make a group for lightning. And then let me make a new VCA in samples, because why not? I will assign that to my new group, lightning. And most importantly, I'm going to name it. Did I spell that right? I don't even know. And even more importantly, I'm going to color code it. VCAs are bright yellow, otherwise you can't find them and they hide. So make sure this is working. Great. Percussion, I have my two auxes, and I haven't actually started assigning any of the outputs yet, but I do not have a percussion VCA. So again, let me check out the percussion and see if there's a group for all of it. There isn't, otherwise I would see a solid black circle over here. So, oh, actually, we've got more down here. Hold on. Maybe we're going to get a solid black circle. Nope. So I'm going to make a group and call it perc, and then we're going to make a VCA. Call it perc. Assign it to the proper group. So exciting. Make it yellow, because otherwise it won't work properly. Watch it work. Fantastic. Bass, that already came up well. There's already a group made for that. Guitars, I believe, should have imported. They did not. Right now, they're controlling a group called rhythm guitar, which happens to just be one of the two guitars, and as it turns out, the guitar that we didn't use. So I'm going to make a new group and call it guitars, and just reassign this guy to guitars. We got keys. That's already assigned properly. Horns. We do have several sets of horns, but that I'm only going to split them up for the audio routing. I'm not going to split them up for any other purpose. And then I do have one VCA for all the horns, which it does not look like is assigned properly. So let me select all of my horn tracks. You may have noticed that I am selecting tracks by just dragging around in the edit window. That is this fantastic function which ties the edit selection to the track selection I love it. I use it all the time. Some people it drives crazy. So, but if you don't know about it, it is this little button up here, which I'm turning on and off, and it just makes it really quick for me because it's a lot quicker to just drag a rectangle in the edit window than it is to click on one track, scroll up, find the shift key without looking, and click on another track. Anyway, that's why I'm doing it. Selected all the horns. Look at that. I see a group called Horns Odd. So apparently that's Horns Audition. So I'm going to assign my horn VCA. And it's actually kind of important. Well, it doesn't matter. You could probably just make new groups. That would be exactly the same as some old groups. But I don't like having extraneous, irrelevant things in a session. So I will only make groups that I need. And also, I'll know that they're ones that I made because they're at the bottom of the list and they're only really being used through the VCAs. They don't have anything to do with the groups that whoever was tracking the session were making along the way, which are much more to do with either something directly to do with mixing or editing, or it can sometimes be a great forensic way to find out when things were recorded. Because generally there will be something called edit group, and that's all your basic tracks, and you'll actually know who was playing live, who's an overdub, and that can explain weird anomalies and things and let you figure out if the bleed you're hearing is actually the same performance as the thing that's in the session. Then really quickly, we've got lead vocal. Now you might think, well, okay, you don't need a VCA for the lead vocal, and I would say that might turn out to be true, but I'm going to go ahead and make one anyway because I want a quick way to turn things on and off, and it turns out there already is one, so that's good. I only need to make the VCA. And it's called LV, and it has to be yellow. And then background vocals, exactly the same thing. There should already be a group. Yep, VGVs. BGVs, and again, we will name these BGVs. I'll just use the same terminology. Background vocals are one of the enigmas of working on songs. They can be called BGVs, BVs. There are a couple other terms I've heard, and the weird thing is there are people who will not have any idea what you're talking about if you say BGs. They think you're just talking about the group from the 70s and 80s, when in fact you just mean backgrounds. But that doesn't make sense to people who call them BVs. I have no idea why. And I'm just going to group Uroy and Ziggy together as a lead vocal because this VCA is not really going to be about riding the vocal or a real mix aspect. It's really just for the muting capabilities. All right, I think we finally have a session where we can listen to something. So now we finished stage one of organizing the session, which is the color coding so I can find things quickly and also importing from my template. And the next thing we're going to do is make sure that every single track in the session is part of some VCA group. And generally these groups will be large, but I will have every single track under a VCA because that'll allow me very quickly later on to move with groups of instruments and try out different arrangement ideas and work on small subsets of the tracks. So now it's time to start listening to things. So the first thing I'm going to do is just bypass all the plugins on my stereo mix bus, just so that I'm starting from pretty much the same place their rough balance was. And the reason I do that is one, just to get a handle on how the tracks are sounding with my routing, but also to make sure that I've actually routed everything properly and I don't have some weird delay now, because that can happen as you reroute everything in the session. Things can disappear and I don't want it to sound very different for right now. So I'm going to hit play, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and start muting VCAs, making sure the VCAs are controlling the right things by soloing them up, and then get down to the point where all we're listening to is drums, and then we're going to start mixing.
Fly Rasta.
Don't fly Rasta.
And that conga's pretty loud, but we'll get to that. All right. And also, I'd like to point out, there's a lot of talk about monitoring and what level you should work at. And first of all, monitoring is the most important part of mixing. If you can't hear, you can't mix. So make sure that whatever it is that you're mixing on is something that will tell you what's going on in terms of having some sort of frequency response. And you're in a room where you're not listening to the room, you're listening to your speakers. And the other thing is pay attention to how loud you listen and for how long. Personally, I either listen really loud or really quietly. And at the beginning of working on a mix, I listen really loud because, first of all, it helps me be able to hear things, especially when I'm listening to individual tracks. I'm not guessing at the impact of the kick or the snare. It's does it thump me in the chest or hit me in the head? And the other thing is I really get a sense for how it feels when it's loud. Once I have the sound of the instruments together, then I tend to work very quietly because you can really only judge balance quietly because your ears will start to shut down and they try to protect themselves from yourself. And so you can't really make any subtle decisions while things are loud. So then I work very quietly. Medium volume to me is almost useless, which is sad because if I could always just work at sort of a prescribed 80 something dB, I could work all day, never touch my monitor pot, but that's not the way it works. The only part of the Neve we're using today is the monitor pot. And the Neve has a stepped monitor pot. A nice click. And this is because I use discrete resistors instead of a potentiometer. But what it also means is that I've got positions that are familiar to me. And if you don't have a stepped pot, which 99% of you won't, I would actually really recommend marking a couple of levels on your monitor pot because that way you actually set yourself up a reference that you can use while you're mixing. So my two reference levels are one click up from being off completely and really loud. So I'm going to start off really loud and we're just going to go through and I'm going to solo up the drum tracks. And normally I will sort of cycle through and solo and listen and unsolo. And I'm going to do things, but I've been told I really shouldn't talk while the music is playing. So I'm going to go through and solo so you can have a listen. Then I'm going to start doing things. I'm going to talk about them. The very first thing I'm going to do is there are a few plugins left in this session. This session is actually very light on plugins compared to a lot of sessions I get. 90% of the plugins that are in the session right now are ones I've imported. But there are some plugins in here, and I want to hear what they are. So I'm going to solo up each of the tracks individually or in groups, like with the kick drum. I've got 3 different microphones, and I'm going to solo them in groups and by themselves to get an idea of how they interact and start making decisions about what I'm going to use and what I'm not going to use. So now looking at this snare top mic, there is a gate on it. And normally I would bypass a gate that's on drums. I like drums to be natural and open. But I've also read the comments in this session, and if you look up at the kick track, it says, "Note, I liked gating." Now, I don't know who I is in this context, but Ziggy does a lot of the overdubs himself, and it could well have been Ziggy himself, and if not, it's certainly someone involved in the project, so now I'm much more open to listening to it. So here is the snare track with the gate on. And here's with it off. So while to me that snare sounds very unnatural being gated so tightly, what I'm noticing almost immediately is that this is probably less about the sound and much more about the pattern. There are a lot of ghost notes in the way Steve is playing the drum part. I'm assuming this is Steve Ferroni on this track. And they're trying to tighten up the kick snare interaction within the beat. So now I'm going to listen in context and see if having the snare gated is bugging me. If it is, then I'll back off on the range of the expander so that it'll still be gating but not quite as much. And if it isn't bugging me, I'm just going to leave it because that's what they were going for, and I'm a fan of having stuff done for me. So let's see how it sounds with and without the gate in the track. So this is with the gate. And here's without. Kind of a subtle difference, but I'm going to go ahead and leave it in because why not? Then they also had an EQ on this snare top. Looks like they're just adding some body. Again, whenever there are plugins in the session, I listen to try and figure out why they're there, and then I just decide whether I like it or not. And I really try and treat it as if the track were recorded that way already. I don't treat it as, oh, I see what they're going for, and now I'll do it slightly differently. I either keep it or I get rid of it. And that's kind of it with stuff that comes in on a session. All right, so here is the snare drum with their EQ that they gave me. Here's without. kind of a subtle change. It's really more just about the body of the snare, sort of the bottom that comes along with the attack. So you got the crack on top, and then the body is that lower mid-range area where they're boosting. So here it is again without. Pretty subtle, but I think really what it helps to do is to move the snare drum forward in the balance of the drums. It just sounds a little bit drier. It's a way to accomplish something that you could also accomplish just by turning the snare drum up or something like that, but I'm going to go ahead and leave it in for now, and we'll see what happens. The snare bottom mic has a gate on it. In this case, I would never even bother listening to that. I just leave it, because why not? And I probably am not going to use a whole lot of the snare bottom. Then, the next thing I'm going to listen to is the tom tracks. And this is actually a very important part of prepping a mix for me. So let's have a listen to these. Okay, so there are two things I'm listening for. One is how much of the rest of the kit is coming in to the tom mics, and how good does that leakage sound to decide whether I want to use them. The other thing is how much are the toms ringing. In this case, the toms are actually ringing enough that I probably don't want to leave those tracks open. They can be a very important part of the drum sound, but they can also be a very messy part of the drum sound. And I don't know the drum pattern well enough yet to know whether or not he goes to a crash or a ride in a certain section. But if you think physically about where the toms are compared to the cymbals, they're always right below them, and ride cymbals especially can go absolutely nuts in the rack tom mic and the low tom mic, and I just don't want to deal with it. So I will do the Pro Tools version of gating, which in this case I've actually left the cuts that I made. So I notice he never plays the first tom track, so I'm just going to go ahead and mute the audio. I could even hide this and make it inactive. Then very few tom hits on this track. In fact, there's only one little tom fill in the middle. But here I'll play you. This is tom 2 in the bridge. So all I'm going to do is cut the audio right to the beginning of this tom hit, and if we zoom in, you'll see I'm pretty much right on it, and there's a very short fade to bring that in. And then I tend to actually fade out these toms very, very slowly, because what happens is toms are usually something you end up EQing a lot to make them really big, or you might send them to an Aphex to add extra top end, or they might have a reverb. So when they come in all of a sudden, they can really change the character of the kit, which is fine when you hit the tom, but because an event actually happens, so you have a new sound to change the sound of the kit. But if you take them away just as abruptly, all of a sudden the rest of the kit will change in sound for no apparent reason. So I do a very short fade in right at the attack of the tom, and then a very long fade out. So that's what I've done here. And if we look through the rest of the track, and you can usually do this visually, if you're not really familiar with what waveforms look like, and this is something you learn just from mixing a lot, and depending on the recording, the tom may not be as obvious. It's a great way to go through and mute tom tracks like this, is you can actually do it in real time while listening. If you go ahead and hit play, hear a little bit of drum, and then I'm going to zoom in on this track in real time, and I can see I have little blobs for every snare drum hit, and none of these are toms. So I can let this play, go through, eventually I'll run into a larger waveform, confirm that it is a tom, and using keyboard shortcuts or whatever, do quick edits, or even just sort of select the tom hit and separate the region and go back later and clean them up. And that's a great way to go through the track in real time, and you can usually do 2 or 3 tom tracks at a time. In this case, I've already done it, and he barely ever hits the toms. So I'm just going to go ahead and mute the rest of that track. Then we've got a second floor tom here. Again, exactly the same thing. And then there's a track called Timbali, which, as it turns out, in this kit is being used very much like a tom. And it was probably set up right next to the snare drum as a second tom. And if I listen to the bleed here, it's just hi-hat and snare. It's going to make things messy. So I'm going to treat this exactly like a tom track and go ahead and mute where the timbali isn't. So now I've got these 4 tracks down to some very tiny little chunks of audio, which I don't really have to think a lot about, which is great. Later on, what I'm going to do, once I have the drum kit more shaped, is decide if I need to treat the toms in any special way, because especially when they're only hit a couple of times in a song, sometimes you really want to make that an event, and there were a couple of tracks in my template that can help that happen. But for now, I'm just going to keep going through the drum tracks. The next thing we get to in terms of the normal multi-mic setup is the overhead track. So that's something I'll usually listen to very carefully because there are two philosophies for recording overheads. One is you try and get a stereo picture of the drum kit through two microphones that are above the kit. The other philosophy is to have cymbal microphones. Personally, when I record multi-mic drums, I will use the overheads as cymbal mics. They will be spread out wide, they'll be pointing straight down, they'll be pretty high right over whatever cymbals there are in the kit. There are quite a few people, though, who use an XY technique, or they'll be right over the drummer head, or they'll be outside but pointing in towards the snare drum to try and get a picture of the whole kit. So the very first thing I need to do is understand what sort of overheads these are. So let's have a listen. Pretty good picture of the kit, but what I'm going to do is go down later in the song because I remember from listening to the toms that we're on some cymbals later. Okay, so in this case, the snare drum is almost as loud as the cymbals. Plus, the cymbals don't really sound that great to me in these mics. So I'm going to treat this more as an extra drum kit pair of microphones than I am a set of cymbals. We'll figure out later on where I'm going to actually get the cymbals from. The good thing is the cymbals are barely used in this track. So the hi-hat is a very important part of the kit. Crash is not so much. As long as you hear them happen, they could almost be white noise, and it doesn't really matter. Then we have some extra tracks. There is a mono room track, which let's check out, and this actually has a plugin on it. Everybody's favorite crushed up room. So they've used a Bomb Factory 1176. This is actually something that's really common. You'll get sessions with really simple old plugins, like the Bomb Factory plugins that are free with Pro Tools, EQ3s, and some people might wonder, well, why don't they use the better sounding plugins? And a reason is, while you're making a record a lot of times, you don't know who's going to work on it next. You're going to work on it in 3 different studios. You're going to have to work on it on your laptop. It's very likely that every single person in the world has this plugin, and if you use it to help shape your sound, they'll have your sound. And when we listen with and without this compressor, you'll understand it's actually a big part of the sound. So that's with the compressor. Here's without. Turn that up. And here's with. And without. So this compressor is the sound of this microphone, so it's really important for me to, at least for now, just to leave it exactly as it is. I'm going to turn it back down so it's more in the balance that they sent me. And let's check out the last few mics. We've got 2 sets of room mics, room and room far. So I'm going to make the assumption that room is close. So this is a nice sounding set of room mics. Obviously, they're in a very good room, but there's a very interesting thing going on, and I'm going to turn this up and play it again. What I want you to listen for is the stereo picture of the kit. What's very interesting is that it all seems very well balanced, but the kick drum is over on the right. So that's just something to make a note of. It may not matter, I might not care, but if later on I'm having trouble with the low end because the kick doesn't feel like it's in the middle and it starts to fight with something else, that's on my little mental checklist of stuff to check out later on. And let's check out the far room. Okay, this room is obviously much further away. It is also, interestingly, incredibly left heavy. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do here is use one of my favorite plugins, the trim plugin, but I'm using it in multi-mono mode. So instead of being a stereo trim plugin, I have a left trim plugin and a right trim plugin. I'm going to go up to this little link symbol, turn off the link, and I am going to flip to the right side controls and turn up the right side until it feels centered, and then I'll start to listen to what's going on in the drum kit. I'll realize it's more than 6 dB off, switch this to 12 dB mode. Okay, so now on the meters, if you have a look, it looks right heavy, and it still sounds a tiny bit left heavy to me. So I'm not going to worry about what it looks like, because I really don't care, because people don't look at mixes, they listen to them. And I don't know for sure that I'm even going to use any of this at all.